You are listening to the Small Town Big Arts podcast. I'm your host, Jeffrey Kirshner, the CEO of the Academy Center of the Arts in Lynchburg, Virginia. In my own work as an arts leader, I have found it difficult to access resources for arts organizations and artists serving smaller communities. On each episode, Small Town Big Arts sets out to drive conversations and provide inspiration for those serving smaller communities through the arts. If you like what you hear, please rate and review us and share with your friends and colleagues who are working to promote the arts in smaller communities across America. You can also learn more by visiting us at smalltownbigarts.com. Well, I am very excited about this month's episode. We have been speaking to arts leaders, community leaders, examining arts organizations. And this week, what I want to do is take a look at an example of an approach to artwork, to a theatrical endeavor that I think is a fantastic way to reach a community, speak to a community. One of the things that we have found repeatedly over and over again in many successful arts organizations in small communities across America is that they very often, their missions and their orientation is really built around the place where they are. Their identity is really closely knit to that identity. They celebrate where they are. They celebrate their community. They're proud of that community. They tell that community story. And so today I have a playwright with me who I've been really fortunate to get to know over the last few years, who Jim lives about everywhere, I think, in many regards, travels all over the place. But his permanent home right now is in Lynchburg, Virginia, because his wife finds herself at the Mayer Museum at Randolph College. And so I've got with me today James McManus. He's the author of a dozen plays. His plays have been performed and developed at La Jolla Playhouse, Cornerstone Theater Company, Labyrinth Theater Company, the Road Theater, Working Theater, Glass Umbrella Creative, Crisscross Productions, which is in Sydney, Revolt Theater in Melbourne, City Theater, New Dramatist, Roundhouse Theater, Irish Repertory Theater, The Lark, and the August Wilson Center for African American Culture. James was the recipient of the Princess Grace Award for Cherry Smoke. He has taught playwriting at universities across the country, including Princeton University, UNCG, UNCSA, Spelman College, and Carnegie Mellon University. James has received the Helen Merrill Playwriting Award and is a proud alumnus of New Dramatists. Well, Jim, thank you for joining us here on Small Town Big Arts.
Thank you, Jeff.
Well, I just gave a talk to the Literary Managers and Dramaturgs of the Americas conference. As a digital conference, I just gave a talk, and the focus of the talk was the importance of providing the arts to smaller communities in America, and really looking at the arts as a bridge across cultural divides that exist right now. That we're obviously, it's an election year, we're really hyper aware of these divides that exist, and the arts are a place that is a space that people can come together and connect in real space in real time. And that's really going to be important, I think, if we're going to move forward as a society. And so that it was big ideas. It was this digital conference, and I was speaking to a group of dramaturgs and literary managers who most likely were in larger urban markets due to the nature of the work that they do is probably in large theater companies that have the capacity to have a dramaturg, to have literary managers on board. So I tried to think about, well, for them, how can they participate in this, in this work to bring the arts into smaller communities. And I thought of Cornerstone Theater Company in Los Angeles, California, and the project that they did, California, The Tempest, which was a production that they developed over a number of years involving a number of communities between San Francisco and Los Angeles. And those communities included rural communities, farmland of California, and the production toured through these areas. And Cornerstone does a very particular type of work that my friend Jim McManus does as well, and has done work with Cornerstone. So I thought that maybe a place we could start, Jim, is maybe talk a little bit about Radio Man, the production that you did with Cornerstone. Is a little bit of an entry into your process, because I want to talk about the process of plays like Radio Man, because I think that what you do could be really, really helpful to smaller communities that do work. Because I think one of the things that we found over and over again in the time that I've been interviewing organizations that have found success in small communities, very often their identity is deeply ingrained in who that community is, celebrating who lives in that community, the culture of that community. So talk to me a little bit about your work with Radio Man, and it actually, I just found out, connects back to California, the Tempest, actually.
Yeah, and just a real quick thing. It actually, Radio Man wasn't a Cornerstone production, but it had all of the components of it, because what had happened was California the Tempest had gone through Eureka, California, which is about 5 hours north of San Francisco. I used to think San Francisco was Northern California until I went to Eureka. And they had done the Tempest at a old Victorian woodworking mill called the Blue Ox Mill. And one of the nights after a show, one of the producers was sitting with the gentleman who runs the Blue Ox Mill, and he told him about how he was a Vietnam veteran and that he had written a series of poems called Uncle Sam's Tour of Southeast Asia, and that he wanted to show them to him, that he'd always thought that something theatrical could be done with it. And Lester Grant, who had been with Cornerstone when I did Love on San Pedro some years earlier, said to him, I know a playwright who I'd like to look at these poems and possibly turn this into, at the time, he had an idea called the Veterans Monologue Project.
Mm-hmm.
And we were going to take he was going to give the poems to me. I was going to read them and try to turn them into monologues. As we proceeded, we decided that we wanted to do something that was more based in community-based work, which Cornerstone does all the time. And so it expanded from just the monologues and the poems to interviewing veterans all over that part of California. And part of the reason that happened is that Eric Hollenbeck, who runs the Blue Ox Mill with his wife, Viviana Hollenbeck, they bring in veterans who are suffering from PTSD in order to work with their hands, because it has been shown over the years that it quiets the mind. It helps people be able to ameliorate some of the problems of PTSD. And Eric had served in the Ashaw Valley in 1968 during some of the worst fighting of the Vietnam War. So Eric brought it to Lester brought it to me, and then we got some grants together and started going out and interviewing veterans all over Eureka, Blue Lake, all of it's called Humboldt County up there, which is a place way off of the map. And so we started going to VFW halls on a Taco Tuesday night. We started going to places where veterans were getting together and trying to talk through the problems that they had. Most of the guys were Vietnam veterans at the time, but then there were also Iraq veterans,
I was about to say,
and of the recent wars, because I don't know why I'm laughing, but America is always at war, so there's always veterans to talk to. And so the project sort of spiraled from there, where I took the poems and then all of the stories that we're collecting from the veterans and put them into a play that was eventually titled Radio Man.
Yeah, and this style and this process of sourcing a community, a group of people for theatrical material, this approach can be really fantastic for smaller communities. And there's lots of reasons why that is. One is is the very nature of the creation process itself, right? In that, I think very often we look at an outside artist coming into a community to create work. A trust has to be built, right? And this direct involvement builds a relationship that is really pretty powerful. I mean, going back to Cornerstone, I do know that that Love in San Pedro was done with Cornerstone. Now, this was done in Los Angeles, but I still think it's a great example of this. Share a little bit about Love in San Pedro, because I think we can probably use that as a jumping off space too, to kind of talk a little bit about how the style of what you do could be brought to a small community and engaged and build that relationship, build trust, break through some barriers, which I know we're going to get into in a little bit too, of how people conceive what theater is, which is a big part of, I think, what we'll talk about today. So talk a little bit about Love in San Pedro too, and that process.
Sure. Back in, I think it was 11, I was a part of a group called New Dramatists, where you have a 7-year residency as a playwright. And there were some Mellon Foundation grants that were given to different theaters to bring playwrights in. And Cornerstone was doing something called the Hunger Cycle at that time. And I believe it was a series of 5 plays about hunger that was going to be put on over the course of somewhere between 3 and 5 years. And you were able to choose whatever community that you wanted to work with. Cornerstone took you out into the community and showed you different aspects of Los Angeles so that the playwright could decide who he or she wanted to work with. And I went to Skid Row. It was adjacent to where Cornerstone's offices were at that time. And walking through this place that I'd heard so much about. And
it's dramatic too.
Yeah.
When you go through there.
It really is, especially at night, because, you have anywhere between sometimes up to 40,000 people that are sleeping either on the streets or in the what are called SROs, single room occupancy apartments, within a very small part of downtown Los Angeles. Excuse me. And so I walked through there, and there was a church called the Church of the Nazarene that had a sandwich board outside that said karaoke 7 p.m. And I'm like, I'm coming back for karaoke. And I went in there, and I was with Shashir Kurapu, a friend of mine who directed it. And it was all the residents of Skid Row were sitting there and the preacher and his wife had one of those old Mr. microphones.
Oh yeah, I remember
from
those.
Like the 80s.
Yeah.
And all of the equipment was old, and everybody that was in there, was weather beaten from living on the streets for years. But once the karaoke began, it was one of the most joyous things I'd ever seen. You'd see a guy with a sports jacket and a tie, but no shirt, walk up and sing this gorgeous version of a Shylight song. That followed up by a guy named Cowboy in a duster singing a Bon Jovi song. And I remember looking and thinking to myself, where else in America is this happening? And on that same night, we just happened to get lucky. There was a group of Mennonites from somewhere in Pennsylvania. They came into this karaoke. So you've got like this.
They're doing mission work?
Mission work.
Okay, yeah.
And they all of a sudden wanted to get involved. And so it's the homeless population of Skid Row among these shiny college kids from Pennsylvania singing a version of Ain't No Mountain High Enough that just sounded absolutely gorgeous.
Wow.
And I'm like, this is the framing device of this play.
Yeah.
And it also made me think, well, first of all, I'm working with this community as long as they allow me to. And then that's got to be, this has got to be in the play. This has got to be part of the play. And the community has to feel that I've understood the joy that's in this place and the sense of community that's there. And from there, it just took off. Everybody who I met would take me to their part of Skid Row and show me what they were doing to try to make Skid Row better, how they were misinterpreted by the media, how people would come down and just use them for a 15-second spot.
Yeah.
And they were just trying to humiliate these folks.
Yeah.
Because this is America, and poverty is criminalized.
Yeah.
And so I got a chance to see 15 different organizations, from Operation Facelift Skid Row to Skid Row Housing Trust. So there were the nonprofits, and then there were just the people that were like, we're going to make Skid Row a little bit better than it was the day before.
Yeah. And if you hear that story of how this was the genesis of this project and how it works, and moving beyond the stereotypes that we have, you can see why I want to talk to Jim today about smaller community arts, because I think that the story of small community America needs to be told, and I think and it's important that these stories are shared, and I think that people move beyond what they may think of when they think of rural, or they think of small town. You're working on a new project now too, right now, currently, called Gen U. Do you want to talk a little bit about that too, because I want to get into a conversation about how we might apply this approach to work to a smaller community, but you're literally in process right now on a piece. So share a little bit about this piece and how it's materializing and what you're working on right now.
Sure. Gen U came about. I was listening to Michael Moore, the filmmaker, has a podcast called Rumble. And he had these two young women from Buffalo on his podcast who were starting the Starbucks Workers Union. And at some point in the interview, one of them says, we're not Gen Z, we're Gen U, Generation Union. And I thought to myself, this is super interesting, because I grew up union. My dad was a steel worker. My grandpap was a coal miner. So I was steeped in it. But these folks were not steeped in it. They were actually activated by the Bernie campaign of 2016 to take agency over their own lives. And they started this union up in Buffalo, New York. And that was where it first began. And I decided that I wanted to start interviewing everybody that was part of this nascent movement. And I actually went, the first thing that I did was I signed up to work in an Amazon warehouse. And I worked for 2 weeks in Burbank in an Amazon warehouse to try to get the lay of the land. And when we started interviewing people for the play, it was actually the Starbucks workers who got back to us. And what I find so interesting about doing this type of work is that you go in with this preconceived idea of like, I'm going to talk to these people, these people, these people. And you can't control who's going to talk to you. You can send out emails, you can call. You're beholden to who shows up at the meetings. You're beholden to who wants to tell you their stories. And it's so wonderful, because then, it's the phrase, you're getting volunteers, not hostages. And so the Starbucks workers were the ones who kept coming back. And I immediately realized that most of them are in their 18 to 25. Most are part of the queer community. Starbucks used to be a place that the queer community felt at home in. And that's part of the reason that a lot of these folks are going on strike, is that the corporate structure of Starbucks has changed over the years. And so I'm there interviewing people who, and I'm always aware, I think I said at some point early in the process, it's like, I'm a straight white guy who doesn't live in your community. Is it okay for me to tell this story?
Mm-hmm.
And most of the time, as a playwright, when I've asked that question, they're like, nobody else has asked us. And it always felt like the moment from Roger and Me where Michael Moore went into Flint and you could see the light bulb go on. And people are like, you want to talk to me? You want to hear my story?
Yeah.
And then they take agency over it. So we've been in process for about 18 months or so, interviewing as many people as we can. I've written a first draft of it. We did it over Zoom, took feedback from the community, which is a huge part of this process, which is, I think, what gives it buy-in, which is why it works.
It's theirs, right?
It's theirs.
It's theirs. Yeah.
I specifically say to people when I walk into these communities, I'm like, the stories and the words are yours. I'm borrowing them and using the skill set that I have to make a 2-hour play, but you're going to give me 10 hours worth of material. And I'm going to try to be as careful with it as possible, because people are often sitting there telling you about the worst times of their lives. A lot of these Starbucks workers are homeless. They're sleeping on friends' couches. There's retaliation from the company when they started the union, in the same way history that repeats itself, with the Flint sit-down strike of 1936. It's an American story of people trying to take agency and, in some ways, control of their own lives from what they consider to be an oligarchy that the country has turned into. And that's the story that was happening when Flint did it right after the Great Depression. And I'm always cognizant of that idea that history doesn't always repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme.
Yeah.
And that's the way it feels with this Gen U story. And so now, I've got a first draft. And as you know, with everything with theater, it's like we're now waiting for a MAP fund grant.
It's always the case. It's always the funding.
There's always a grant, that we're waiting for. But, this will be the 4th or 5th community-based play that I've done. And I've been able to, to learn some things through the process about how to get folks to talk to you who don't necessarily think that they have a story to tell. And once everybody realizes that they have a story to tell, then it kind of demystifies the idea of theater.
It's like, which I want to get into.
It's like, what is it really? It's somebody in front of you telling you their life story and hoping to entertain you with it and make you laugh or cry. And then you go out with a better understanding of somebody's world. But for the most part, in theater and a lot of the arts, there's a feeling that the stories have a certain class structure to them. That they're only for wealthy people to listen to about wealthy stories. And when you explain to them that not only am I going to use your words and those are going to be what you hear coming back at you from the stage, but we want you to give feedback. We want you to audition. We want you to be in the play.
That's a part I want to talk about too, right? The community participation and performance, right, is also a part of this.
Yeah, it's just fantastic.
Yeah. And then the community wraps their arms around it.
Yes.
And that's, I think that can be one of the most powerful parts of the arts. And I think so. I think getting back to talk a little bit about, I guess, prejudice, for lack of a better way of saying it. We do have prejudice that sort of operates in both directions. I think very often prejudice may exist about how people think. Like just going back to Skid Row, the ideas that people have about Skid Row, and then the story that you told about the karaoke and the joy and the complexity of these individuals and where they live and the circumstances of what's going on and how rich that is in many regards. But we could easily dismiss it. We could drive past it quickly, have an idea of what it is, and move on. I think we have a lot of that going on very often in smaller communities too. People have an idea of what that is. They drive through quickly. They make assumptions about what people are, how people operate, what they think, how they feel, what their intentions are. But there's also prejudice that can exist in the other direction too, in regards to what is theater. And I think in some ways practitioners of theater in America are guilty, are a part of why there may be that feeling. We can get into a little bit of that. I do think that what we're talking about here is this process has to be really personal. It has to be really about the relationships that exist between the artist and the community itself. The idea that it's their words coming back, is really important. So I want to. I'll share, for a previous interview I had with Dustin Williams, who runs Wolfbane Productions, that's here in Virginia, in Appomattox. I didn't know this, but he shared with me that the reason that they named it Wolfbane Productions as opposed to Wolfbane Theater Company was that he knew that if he called it Productions, that more people would come see their shows, because if he called it a theater company, people wouldn't come because they wouldn't think it was for them.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so I want to talk a little bit about that, right? That this notion sometimes in regards, it's divide created by class, it's divided by education. This idea that somehow theater, right, isn't for me, right? If I'm on Skid Row, theater is not for me. Or if I live in Appomattox, Virginia, theater is not for me. And the theater that I love personally is the type of theater that you do that that it's accessible and open and approachable,
I'm sorry.
No, yeah, please. No, interject.
No, when you were talking about Love on San Pedro, we put it on at a mission right in the heart of Skid Row. And it was on either the 4th or the 5th floor, and it was a gymnasium. And they built risers on each side. And I remember the first time that I went to see the set, my first thoughts were, this is a beautiful set. This is perfect. I love that we're doing it at a mission. The basketball hoops were put up so that, we could do the play for the evening and everything. And then I looked and I counted, and there were about 220 seats. And I thought to myself, we're not going to get 10 people here every night, because nobody's going to want to come to Skid Row, especially the normal theater crowd.
Mm-hmm.
But what ended up happening was that throughout Skid Row itself, because so many people were involved in the acting, in the telling of stories, in the story circles that we gathered, word of mouth started spreading. And so we started selling this thing out every night. And on the final Sunday, I went out for it. And this is, to me, speaks to the power of it and what theater can do if it's actually democratized and for the people. On that final day, there were about 80 people that couldn't get in. And it was heartbreaking turning people away, because this might have been their only experience with theater. This might have been, they wanted to see their friends on stage.
Yeah.
But we had to close the doors. At intermission, Sorry.
Yeah, yeah.
We went outside to this little veranda, and all 80 people had stayed, and they were huddled against the vents that came out from the gymnasium, and the people that were closest to the vents were relaying the
Oh my God.
dialogue back
Wow.
to other folks. And somehow for the second act, then we figured out a way to get all 80 people in there, and the fire marshal was not called or anything. But think about the
Yeah,
power of
that's
that. It's
amazing.
like folks who it's
Yeah.
like you're telling our stories, and those are our people, and this is the only chance. It's ephemeral as all get out, as theater always is. But it's like we want to hear these stories. And that was like one of the first bugs for me. It was like, besides my stories about Western Pennsylvania, which I write all the time, I'm like, I want to be involved in community-based theater because I get to interview people.
Mhm.
I get to watch them come out of their shells. I get to watch them audition for a piece when they have no idea what an audition even means,
Yeah.
and we would often tell them to just grab the newspaper, read 2 lines of the newspaper, because we wanted to hear if they could project.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then once you start seeing it on stage, Jeff, it's like, goodness, maybe my lines are being flubbed. And who cares? The crevices on their faces, the lived experience that they're giving to the audience, and the fact that the audience is laughing at the, they know the story. They know they're on Skid Row.
Mhm.
They know these aren't ideal situations. So when somebody pops off and makes a joke about how their second house is in Beverly Hills with a Rolls Royce, they feel that joke and they roll in laughter. And that the audience was speaking back to the actors on stage.
Mm.
One of my favorite anecdotal stories was there was an actor on stage who every night had a long monologue, and we had no idea if we were going to hear 2 minutes of it, 30 seconds of it, what order it was going to be in, anything. And one night he is struggling up there. He catches me out of the corner of his eye in the audience, looks at me and goes, "Line." So I fed him the line, and we rolled from there.
Yeah. And
And
probably one of the coolest moments, probably, that for that audience, actually, it's like I don't know, that's what's beautiful about theater, right? It's present.
so present. And, it's like I'm not naive enough to think that everybody's lives are being changed by art, by
Mhm.
the 6 weeks that we worked on this piece. But we had 26 actors for Love on San Pedro. 23 of them were from the Skid Row community. And I keep in contact with a lot of those folks, and they have been able to reconnect with family. They've been able to reconnect with loved ones, get jobs, get off of the street. And so many of them say, I I look back at Love on San Pedro, and I didn't want to be in it because the reason I'm on Skid Row is that I didn't often show up for things.
Mm.
But I wanted to show up for this because I wanted people to know what our lives look like.
Yeah.
And that helped them reconnect with whatever, because they always felt like they had left a better part of themselves somewhere in the past. And by telling the story, they were able to exercise some of those demons and find, reconciliation, whatever it happened to be that they were looking for. And certainly that doesn't happen all the time, but I was forever changed as an artist by doing that. And some of their lives were forever changed by doing the piece. And how often can you say that if you go to see another production of Chekhov?
Sure. Yeah.
I love Chekhov,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
it's like, and so that to me is the connection, the democratization of theater that we don't often get to see if we're just putting on a production from 150 years ago, or even something, that's mine, that I've drawn from whole cloth, either made up or something from my childhood or whatever it happens to
Mhm.
be. I didn't do it with a community, and to do it with a community is, it's something, man.
Yeah, and what I what I love about this style and approach to creating work is, so when I've looked at the organizations that have really spoke to me, and again, it's not just about them, the organizations being exciting organizations to talk about, but it's also smart business approach. When organizations have taken it upon themselves to tell their community stories, to represent their community in public space, to bring people together in and around dialogue that means something to them. These are the organizations that really thrive in small communities because, I mean, at the end of the day, that's what makes the arts powerful, right? Is that it connects us somehow to our humanity and to our story. And I do think, due to the nature, right, of how arts funding works in America, and inevitably, and it that total makes total sense, large urban markets with big populations, and you know revenue sources that are, major foundations and corporate entities and all the other things that exist there. That very often, theater in America is being generated in urban markets, and and whether and it makes sense. I mean, the stories are very often going to speak to an urban population. I mean, that's just going to be the nature of the artwork, and that makes sense, and I think that's valid. But these stories there's so many stories, right?
Yeah.
There's so many stories in America, and I think that there's something like 46 million people in America living in rural communities. There's millions more living in communities less than 100,000 people. Um, you know, Probably half the country lives in what we would deem smaller communities,
Mhm.
right? Right here is our, I think in many ways is our political moment, right? Where stories, right? Media outlets are also in major urban markets, and stories are not being told. People feel unheard, and they're upset, they're angry about it, and then that creates a divide. And I think that um, artists coming into a community, engaging with that community, telling that community's story is probably also healing. I can only imagine in Skid Row, for them, what a healing experience that was to matter, you know. And I think, I think anybody in a small community, your community is a valuable community. It's an important community, and I think, uh, theater is a fantastic tool. It is a fantastic tool, for embracing who people are and connecting people, and I think just using it in the way that you're using it, I think is really powerful. So I think, one of the aims of the conversation today was, I really kind of wanted to open a door to awareness of this type of theatrical work. I mean, many may be aware of, whether we call it docudrama, or are there other, what other terms might we give this style of community based theatrical work? Do we have a label for it? Do we have a
I
name
don't know.
for it?
I always use community based or docudrama,
Yeah.
because it always, there is a journalistic aspect about it. As a playwright, you feel a little bit like the savvy news hound
Yeah.
going in,
Yeah.
and at the same time, you don't want to do what other savvy news hounds have done, which is to go in, tell a story about somebody for 15 minutes and then leave. And so to me, that's the fact that there's something before and something afterwards feels important. And I wanted to mention that, it was back in '04 when I was living in Pittsburgh that before I even knew what community-based theater was, there, I interviewed a bunch of steel workers in '04 because in 1984 there was a blast furnace that they had affectionately named Dorothy 6 that U.S. Steel was closing. And these guys in their green work uniforms stood out in front of this blast furnace to not let U.S. Steel come in and raise it because they knew that their lives and their livelihoods were going away. 20 years later, there was an organization called Rivers of Steel, and I went to them and they had scores of interviews that had been done 20 years ago with those guys. And I was like, can I get some of those guys? I want to interview them now and see if we can make a play about this. And the first time I ever got people into a room, and I didn't even know what the hell I was doing, I got like 10 or 12 steel workers around the room. Have you ever tried to get a group of older guys to start talking about their feelings? You know? And I remember very early on saying, what was it like back in 1984 when you were doing this? And one of the guys had a muscle shirt on with his cigarettes rolled up over the left shoulder. And he looks at me and says, what the fuck do you know about 1984? You were still sucking on your mama's titties. And I'm like, all right, this is going to go extremely well. And luckily, one of the other guys came over and was like, just give him a chance. And we ended up putting that play on at the pump house of what used to be a mill next to the Monongahela River in Pittsburgh. And the same guy who said that to me organized a group to come every Sunday night after the Steeler game to watch their history play out on stage. And they were tailgating before the show.
I love it.
And I'm like, this is community-based work.
Yeah.
Now they don't think that theater is something that they can't go to.
Yeah.
And that's what always bothers me is that when I would go home for Christmas or something and I would see some of my old buddies who were truck drivers or in the service, and the first question they'd always ask me, they'd be like, so like a play, Jimmy, do you write all the words? And I'm like, yeah, I write all the words. And they're like, it doesn't feel like it's for me. I had one guy tell me one time, he's like, I always feel like I'm going to use the wrong fork if I show up at the theater.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I get what you're saying. And what always bothered me, Jeff, was that if you engage these guys about season 2 of Sopranos, they could tell you about the A story, the B story, Paulie Walnut's story. It wasn't as if they didn't understand what made good drama.
Yeah.
They just didn't feel like theater as drama was for them.
Yeah. The form.
The form.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just the cost. It was this feeling that somebody else didn't want them there.
Yeah.
And when you do community-based work, we're like, not only do we want you there, but we want you in it. It's your stories. You can tell me, the playwright, what I've gotten right and gotten wrong. Yeah, I can't tell you I'm going to change every single thing, but, because I've got to make it a 2-hour story somehow. But once they're involved in it, it doesn't look like something that they can't ever attend again.
Yeah. And I think that is, that's so powerful. And even hearing, these spaces and venues in which these shows took place in too, right? Redefining. The organization I run, we're always sort of contending with that a little bit. And that we have this, restored, 19th century, or early 20th century theater that feels somehow untouchable, unattainable. You're not supposed to go in there, and I hate that about. It's beautiful. It's beautiful,
yeah.
but I really don't want anybody to feel like, oh yeah, I'm not supposed to go in here. This isn't for me. This isn't my space. We want it to be their space. And sometimes that can be really difficult to overcome. But even from a practical standpoint, if I'm in a small community, I might not have a theater space. But theater, if we, it's the empty space, right? You just need, you need a room and an audience and a performer. That's all you need, right?
Yeah.
That's all you need to have it happen and for it to take place. And that's the power of it. It can move anywhere. It can go anywhere. You don't have to have a ton of infrastructure to have it execute. You can do it in Skid Row in a gymnasium. And I think that is an incredibly powerful tool for those trying to either produce artistic work in small communities that both is going to be meaningful and powerful, but also practical, right?
Practical. You get to ask them, where would you like the performance?
Yeah, where's a space that's comfortable for you that
What's
you want to come
comfortable?
to, that's your space,
And
right?
where is the community going to come to?
Yeah.
Where will they feel like they can walk into and this is theirs?
Yeah.
And that's such a great feeling when you see people coming in and thinking, oh, this is theater, but this is something that I would do again and again. There is something that is, and off-putting is the right word, but some folks, they see like the ostentatious lamps and that a beer cost $18 and they're like, this is not my place.
Yeah.
But the steel worker who brought his own cooler of Iron City beer to hand out that night, he felt like that was his place to watch that play.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't say we were buddies by the end of it, but he at least liked the representation that was put on stage. And I found through doing this type of work, like when I first started out, I always wanted, if it was a difficult story to tell, I would think to myself, I don't want to leave everybody in a place of hopelessness. And, sometimes Skid Row, you're a steel worker who's lost his job, you're a Vietnam veteran with PTSD, and they encourage you over and over again, tell the story as it is. Don't sugarcoat this. Don't give it a happy ending. With Radio Man, it's like they are all well aware of how many suicides a day there are of former service people. And they want that to be a part of the story because they need people to know these things. And in some ways, you get this feeling that they've been screaming into the wilderness for decades. We're here, we're dying. Somebody come tell our stories so that something changes. And they get to tell you it, and it helps people in the community. I watched it with Radio Man, but Vietnam veterans, these grizzled old guys coming up to me after the show, and you're always fearful as a playwright that somebody's going to be like, I have no idea what I just saw on stage. That wasn't us. That was, don't ever do this to us again. You exploited us in some way.
Yeah.
Always been the opposite, because when you're using their words, there can't be anything, it can't be exploitative if you're using their words.
Yeah.
And they know that and they feel it.
Yeah. And they know you, I think that's the other beautiful thing about this process. So I think as we kind of wrap up, Jim, obviously, Jim works with a number of theater companies across the United States. He also does some work in television as well, and he's all over the place. If I were in a small community and I wanted to, let's say, there's other playwrights in this space who do this type of work, but let's sort of start with you. Like if I were in a small community and I were like, I want to bring Jim McManus into my community to create a work about our town, our place, how might they begin that process? What would they do? What would they need to do?
Yeah, that's a great question, because certainly there's always a funding problem in
Sure.
theater. But I was just thinking about this the other day because it was the 1 year anniversary of that train derailment in East Palestine.
Mm,
And I'm like, there are stories there to tell.
yeah.
And it's close to Pittsburgh where I grew up. And I'm like, how do I reach out to them or they reach out to me? And sometimes I don't know the answer other than just finding community organizations that are doing the work in the town. Try to connect with them, try to set up some sort of initial meet and greet, some sort, maybe it's around a monthly meeting that they already have. Bring in a professional playwright and see if there's a way to get funding for it, because oftentimes the community so wants the story to be told that there's money out there to tell it. And it can often be done in a relatively inexpensive way, in the sense that you don't have to have a building. It can, somebody donates the borough building in town
Yeah.
for rehearsals, and you put it on there. Uh, you know, we did events at VFW halls. We did events, at boy, I mean, summer picnics, for the steelworkers union. You show up and folks wanted to, tell you the story from 20 years ago. So it's all a matter of just making the initial call to either me or me trying to make the initial call to them and seeing if there's a way that we can figure out a way to tell this story. Because as soon as I'm always shocked by the fact that I think somebody else has already told this story and that I'm going to be the 15th person who's contacted them.
Yeah.
It's always the opposite.
Yeah.
It's like nobody has contacted us about this. The news doesn't even come here. We wanted to tell this story for a year, I'm sure, in East Palestine.
Yeah, I was just about to say, I'm sure that's the case there.
I'm sure it's the case.
Yeah.
And so I don't, I guess I'm putting out my own PSA right now of like who in East Palestine wants me to figure out a way, whether it's me or another writer, to tell the story, because that has to be told. There's corporate capture and all of that kind of thing that needs to be told there. But in general, it's just the idea of community, of somebody reaching out, somebody asking, is there somebody who wants to tell our story? Or the other way around, of going in and saying, I'd love to tell your story. So it's, it's the old Ralph Nader thing of like, two people get together and sign a petition, and all of a sudden it grows and you can change the world from there.
Yeah.
And that's the way I feel about community-based theater. And, that, along with the fact that there's just millions of dollars in it for me. So,
Well, but I will say, just as we kind of wrap too on a funding standpoint, one of the things that I continually find in these organizations and smaller communities is that they do find funding when they do provide clear value to the community, right? When the value is clear, people will galvanize around it and support it. I think projects like this are really no different. I think once people begin to understand, I think, to Jim's point, if you just get it started, right, it's like, taking a snowball and rolling it down the hill, and then it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. I do think if you can get it started and people begin to understand what's happening, what the process is, that their story is going to be told, then people take interest, and material, funding will materialize. I think that, and I do think there are national funding organizations that are very interested in this type of work. I think people are interested in reaching rural spaces right now and reaching smaller communities. I think that that is definitely the case. And so, but then on the local level too, right? People want to, they want to support their story. They want to hear their story told. And so I think this is a valuable proposition, and people will galvanize around it. So
agreed.
Well, Jim, I really appreciate this. This has been a great conversation and inspiring to me. I'm leaving with a lot. I was a theater practitioner and haven't done it in about a decade. It makes me miss it because this is the kind of theater that I miss. There's a lot of things I sometimes don't miss about theater.
Yeah,
but for some of the very reasons that we talked about today. But this is really powerful stuff, and I hope those out in smaller communities will hear that theater can be much more than $18 glasses of wine and words that they don't understand, and that there's a dress code and and rarity and all the rest of it. So a great pleasure, Jim. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Small Town Big Arts. Remember to rate and review us and share with your friends. To learn more, visit us at smalltownbigarts.com. Until next time, I'm your host, Jeffrey Kirschner.